Profiles on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. I'm Charlie Walters. I'm pleased to have with me today Dr. Jessica West. In her words, she is a sociologist studying the health and well-being of individuals with disabilities across the life course. Following her graduation from Phillips Exeter Academy, Dr. West received a Bachelor of Arts in Social Anthropology from the University of Michigan and a Master of Public Health in Socio-Medical Science from Columbia, as well as a Master of Arts degree in Sociology from Duke, and also a PhD in Sociology from Duke. She has been a fellow at Harvard Medical School and at the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary, and is the author of numerous peer-reviewed publications and the recipient of multiple awards. Dr. West is currently a postdoctoral associate at the Duke University Center for the Study of Aging and Human Development, where her research, again in her words, her research interests include medical sociology, life course and aging, public health, demography, disability, and hearing loss. Jessie, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your work is at the juncture of psychology and medicine and numerous other things. But I'm going to start with this. I've known your family for a number of years, and maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, your father said to me that the research you were doing at that point, which I think was when you were at Duke, it was research no one else had ever done before, which immediately caught my attention, and it's something I've kept in mind all these years. First of all, what was that research? And second, were you aware that no one else had done it before?
Well, I probably chalk a little bit of that up to my dad, bragging about me. So I guess when I started at Duke, I knew I was interested in hearing loss, and I'd been studying hearing loss for a while at that time, and was really interested in pushing into how hearing loss affects not only an individual's mental health, but also how it affects those close to them. Because it was something I was observing, whenever I would go out to dinner with my parents and their friends, that it seems like hearing loss was not only influencing how an individual interacted at the dinner table, but it was also influencing how their spouses interacted and handled things. And so when I started looking into the research on hearing loss in spouses, I found that a lot of it was focused on sort of small scale studies. So they would interview a few couples and talk to them about their experience with having one partner with hearing loss. But there was nothing that was really looking at the bigger, broader, like US population as a whole. And I think that's what sort of came to be the trend in a lot of hearing loss research, is that we can do a lot of research using like electronic health records and look at, patient level, patient specific things, but you can't really, or people haven't really had the chance to use these big data sets to follow people with hearing loss over time and over, multiple observations, and really see their experiences as they play out in a life course perspective. So not just like one shot in time, but over, many years. And so as I was digging into this research on hearing loss in spouses, I actually found the opposite of what these smaller scale studies were finding. So most of the studies look at heterosexual couples, so a male and a female, and they're finding that a man's hearing loss is really difficult for the wife. Like, it's depressing, it's frustrating, all of these negative connotations. When I used this, I use a nationally representative data set called the Health and Retirement Study. So it reflects the entire US population. And I had a sample of around 6,000 couples. And so, much more than just like 13 individuals. I had, 6,000. And I actually found that it was a wife's hearing loss that was more depressing for a husband than vice versa. So it was a little bit different than what the other research was finding. But mine was also looking over many more people over from 1998 to 2016, so a much longer time period. So I think really being able to put hearing loss research into this bigger context and seeing how it plays out for people over their lives has been a really interesting experience.
Now, you're using the term hearing loss. You're not saying hearing impaired. You're not saying deaf.
Right.
You're not saying other things. Why do you use that terminology?
So I kind of flip back and forth. Actually, in a bunch of my published papers, I've used the term hearing impairment. And that's because there really is no good term, I think, at this point to talk about hearing loss. So disability studies scholars have really long stressed the importance of, language is really important, like how we talk about ourselves and other people, like it's really important. So I tend to use hearing loss because I think the term hearing impairment connotes something negative about the individual and about the experience. I think hearing loss does as well. It suggests that you've lost something, which on the one hand, yes, you have. Like your hearing is, not normal per se, but I'm not really a fan of either term. I think something more like hearing function might be better because it indicates it indicates your functionality as opposed to being someone with an impairment or someone who's lost something. But yeah, so I tend to use hearing loss.
Did the data you were looking at show a difference between people who are born with hearing loss and those who acquired it? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not able to tease that apart with the data that I have. So the data that I have was for people, 50 and older at that time. So, and it was self-reported hearing. So people would rate their hearing while using a hearing aid. Is it excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor? And that's a pretty standard way that researchers measure health of various sorts. So this self-rated scale, but I can't really differentiate whether they had this disability growing up or if it's something that they acquired in later life. Most of the hearing losses are acquired later in life, but there is a pretty substantial number of people who develop a hearing loss early in life. But as a way to get at the question, because I think that's a great question, I think what we experience in early life, any stressors or any really important events that we experience in childhood can have major implications for us later on. And that's where this life course perspective in sociology and in other health sciences is really important, because it's suggesting that, what happens to you at one point in time can have these long-term implications for your physical health, for your mental health, for your relationships, for everything. We're not just, a silo, and what happens to us once is just, it stays there. So another study that I'm working on with one of my colleagues at Duke is looking at how the experience of having had a childhood disability, which is defined as any disability before the age of 16, how that affects your mental health later on. So there's been some research that's looked at how having a disability is, as a child, kids with disabilities tend to report more mental health problems. They're less likely to complete various levels of education. So high school, they're less likely to go on to college. So there are some implications in these sort of shorter term windows that a disability can be negative for different psychosocial and educational attainment. But what I'm interested in is, so you had a disability before the age of 16, what does your mental health look like when you're 50? So, and that's what I can actually look at with this study, with this data set that I use. And what I'm finding so far is that people who had a disability in childhood, by the time they're 50, they're still reporting higher levels of depressive symptoms compared to somebody who didn't have a disability growing up. So there's some indication that having a disability in childhood has these long-term implications for your mental health, which is pretty important because it suggests that, okay, well, if you're a healthcare provider and you know that one of your patients has had a disability growing up, well, maybe you need to be helping them get referred to certain mental health services, or just make sure they're supported, and knowing that this is a stressor that can have implications later on.
Now, assuming they do go to pursue, a therapist or counseling, whatever it would happen to be, what about the therapists and the counselors? Are these observations, have they been around long enough that this is built into therapy and counseling, or is this recent enough that it really isn't baked in yet?
So I'm less familiar with the psychological side of things. I do know that, so audiology is the field of like studying hearing and screening people for hearing, getting them into hearing aid services and cochlear implants. So even in audiology, I think there isn't really a good sense of when we should be screening people for hearing loss. So I think that translates then over to other fields of healthcare. So most of the time, it's going to have to be a general provider who is referring someone over to an audiologist to actually get their hearing tested. Most people aren't just like, you don't reach a certain age, and it's not like colon cancer screening where it's like, okay, well, I've hit this age, now I've got to start getting screened for whatever. Even though we know that hearing loss is a major issue for older people, it's not regularly built in for screening, isn't regularly built into their healthcare. So I think that then translates over to the mental health services, where if we don't know that they have a hearing loss, we're not necessarily helping them get the resources that they need. And also, I think there's a lot of stigma that's going to play into it, where someone who has a hearing loss maybe doesn't want to go talk to someone about their experience because it may be too stigmatizing to talk about it. And they may also feel that, well, all of my friends have hearing loss and they're dealing with it. Why do I need help for it? So I think there's a lot of factors at play.
Well, that brings to my mind something else related to what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
The subjectivity of one's hearing loss. Now, an audiologist will be able to give a test with, objective data, but to the person involved, one person's minor hearing loss is going to be another person's major hearing loss, depending on what the data says. How do you ensure the accuracy? Are those tests enough to ensure the accuracy of what's going on?
That is such a big question. And I think that's something that audiologists do struggle with. Yes, the objective tests can give you a sense of how well someone hears and their speech understanding. And I think that's a very good start. It really helps you, program hearing aids to the correct level that will help the person. But, it's so dependent on the situation. Going into a crowded restaurant, that may be really difficult for some people. I think it's really difficult for people without hearing loss and without hearing aids. I think crowded restaurants have always been an issue for everyone. So I think it's important to consider the self-rated component of it, so the self-perception, because as you said, like someone may experience hearing loss as something that really does impact their life and their ability to communicate with other people. It may be isolating for them, but their hearing test may not show that. So we definitely do need a way to sort of balance the two and have them mesh together and really get at it's called a hidden hearing loss, actually. Somebody who their hearing is at a level that the audiogram or hearing test doesn't pick up any major problem, but they do report having issue with like group conversations or in noisy situations. So there can be a mismatch. But again, I'm not an audiologist, so I don't want to like speak too much about or to hearing tests and audiograms, but because I think they do, the self-rated versions and the more objective versions, they both are very important.
Well, it's interesting because what you're saying, I think, is there's hearing loss and there's hearing loss. There's inability to hear anything, and there's inability to pick out a particular sound if you're in a
Yeah.
noisy, the proverbial noisy bar.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. Does the data go deeply enough to show differences in geographic parts of the United States or socioeconomic levels?
Yes, actually. Regional variation in health is a big topic of study, and socioeconomic differences are obviously a very large component of sociology. So some of the research I've done has looked at sort of like the broad census regions of the US. And specifically, I mean, you really just break it down into really, really broad. So it's like the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, and the West. So these are really big chunks. And across, like, hearing loss aside, across all health categories, the South tends to have the worst health outcomes and the lowest life expectancy compared to the other major regions in the US. And then in terms of socioeconomic status, we tend to use educational attainment. Income is often used. I like to use wealth because wealth sort of encompasses like all of your assets, not just maybe what happened in the past year. And there's definite gradients in health. So based on these different measures of socioeconomic status. So somebody who is more highly educated is going to have better health than somebody who's less educated. And somebody with more wealth is going to have access to resources that are going to get them, better health care, better health options than somebody with less wealth. And the same, I have found that this plays out for hearing loss as well, that people with more education tend to have less hearing loss compared to those with, did I say that right? People with more education have less hearing loss than people with less education.
Those with hearing loss who are able to read lips, are they less affected in their mental health negatively?
That's a great question. My personal opinion about lip reading is that it's not always the most effective. I think what I would love the public to know is, like, don't just assume that somebody with hearing loss can read lips, because that's not necessarily the case. And also, even if somebody is a really good lip reader, people, if somebody has facial hair, that can change how someone's reading their lips. Accents can also affect lip reading. So there definitely are people who are very good at lip reading and can get a lot of information that way, but it's not the prime solution to communicating with someone with hearing loss. In the data that I've used, I don't have an indication of whether or not they're lip reading, if they use American Sign Language or some other non-oral mode of communication. So I can't, that's one unfortunate thing, is I haven't really been able to dig into this whole other population of people with hearing loss, and that's the deaf community. And that's, when I say deaf community, I'm speaking with a big D, so a capital D, deaf. And this is really, it's a culture. So it's individuals who hearing loss is not a negative. It's one aspect of their culture, and using sign language is part of their culture. And I would assume that if I did the same study on a population of culturally deaf individuals, their deafness, their hearing loss, that's not going to negatively impact their mental health. What is going to negatively impact their mental health is how the hearing world sort of discriminates against them and makes it more difficult for them to function as, completely normal, thriving human beings.
If someone has acquired hearing loss or lost hearing through, let's say, their job, they work in a factory, or if they're a musician in front of huge amplifiers, if they lose hearing that way, as opposed to a directly physical situation not caused by their environment, is there a difference in how those people react to their hearing loss? In other words, is there a kind of a
Right.
guilt if you're a rock musician and you've lost your hearing by the age 30, as opposed to somebody who
Was
was not affected that way?
right. Yeah. Hmm. I'm trying to think of what I've read recently that would really get to that, because I would think that there is a difference in the cause. I think the cause of the hearing loss um, can be more or less stigmatizing for a person. So if it's something that you brought on yourself, that could be more problematic than if it was just part of the aging process, like it was just a normal thing that happened. Um,
You put it much better than I did in the question. Thank you.
yeah. Well, it's an interesting. Um, I mean, I think it kind of also gets at the question of, is there a difference in if you've grown up with a hearing loss or develop it at some later stage? And that I think goes back to the life course process, and that's what, you know, one of the um, tenets of that framework is that, you know, things that happen to us at different stages, they're going to impact us differently. So something that happens to you in childhood is going to have a different impact on you than, say, something that happens when you're in your 20s or when you're in your 50s or in your 80s. So the same thing can impact us differently. And I think with hearing loss, on the one hand, I think it means you can grow up being like, well, this is just a part of me. This is who I am. I have a hearing loss, and you know, it just, growing up with it is something that is just second nature to you. But I think it can also, on the other hand, sort of mark you as different. And when you're a kid, anything that marks you as different can be difficult for, you know, developing your peer group, or, you know, developing your sense of self. I think so. I can see it going two different ways in childhood. I would hope it would go more towards the positive way, but I think it can also go the negative route.
Is there data showing if there's any difference when a hearing loss person has a spouse who has hearing loss?
Um, yeah, that's something maybe that'll be my next study. I'll look at my couples in the data set and see if there's some different, like if both of the spouses have a hearing loss. My assumption or my hypothesis is that hopefully you would learn how to accommodate, like both of you are dealing with the same thing, so you know, hey, I can't talk to my spouse from another room because I know I wouldn't be able to hear them if they were talking to me from another room. So maybe you're just both so used to it that any of the accommodations are just second nature.
It's fascinating to me that so much of this is uncharted territory.
Yeah. Yeah.
These studies, I mean, how long is this, not the thing you're doing, but how long have these sorts of research has been going on? I mean, I would assume decades, if not a couple of centuries.
Right.
And here
Well,
you
I
are,
mean,
you have found something, but no one
yeah,
is looking into it.
right. I was actually just reading a paper the other day that was looking at racial and ethnic differences in and sex differences in clinical trials among like for hearing loss. So clinical trials related to hearing loss would be like hearing related therapies or different hearing aid or cochlear implant interventions. And what you know, looking back at however long clinical trials have been going on, there is such limited data on any sex differences and any racial and ethnic differences in these hearing loss related clinical trials. And I think that's an issue for clinical trials in general. But what's really important is that somebody published this recently about hearing loss specifically, to be like, hey, these are things that, like, we talk about racial and sex differences in health. Why aren't we talking about it in hearing loss as much?
It seems obvious, and yet obviously it wasn't. And
Right. Right.
I'd like to hear you talk about your personal connection to your research.
Yeah. Yeah. So my dad started wearing hearing aids when he was about 40, but probably should have started a lot sooner. So when I was born, the doctors suggested that I get my hearing tested. And so, as a little baby, I did the hearing test, which looks a little different. The hearing test for infants is not like a raise your hand when you hear a sound. I think they put different sensors on the baby to see if they're responding to sound. And so for me, it did indicate that I didn't have what's called normal levels of hearing. So I had my hearing tested all through, basically middle school, and did find I was, had a pretty mild hearing loss, but not at the point that I needed hearing aids. That didn't happen until I was a junior in high school. So I was 17 when I started wearing hearing aids. And that experience, I consider, age 17 is when I first lost my hearing. So that for me was the real turning point. Even though I knew growing up that I had some level of hearing loss, it didn't really intellectually make sense to me. I just knew I was slightly different and wasn't quite following things as well as other people. But then started wearing hearing aids in high school, and I didn't react very well to it. It was really difficult emotionally for me, because again, when you're in high school and as a kid, you just want to fit in, and it felt like something that was so drastically different. But then when I got to college, I was taking an intro sociology class, and one of my professors came up to me and was like, "Hey, you should write an honors thesis." And she encouraged me to write this thesis on hearing loss. And I really appreciated that because it gave me the chance to look at hearing loss in an objective way. So not just my personal experience with it, but actually understand how other people were living with it. And so I interviewed about 20 people with hearing loss who are under the age of 40. And it was a really eye-opening experience for me, because I figured out finally that there were other people like me, other people who had hearing loss. And that really got me hooked on studying hearing loss and just doing research in general. So that was a real turning point for me. And I've been studying hearing loss ever since.
I want to follow up on some of the things you were just talking about, Jessie. And it may seem like a painfully obvious question to answer, but let me give it to you here. When you started to take or started to use hearing aids, what physical differences did you notice in your hearing? Can you describe those differences?
So the most immediately noticeable thing for me was actually my own voice. When I put the hearing aids in, it changed how I was hearing myself. So my voice didn't change at all to other people, but the way that it was coming into my own head changed. And that for me lasted about 6 months, where it sounded like I was talking through a tin can. So that was a very disconcerting time as I was trying to adjust to, really it was my brain learning how to adjust to sounds coming in differently. Obviously I don't study the brain, but I think, when sound comes in and the brain is trying to interpret it for me was just getting a little confused with my own voice. I think also my hearing loss is mild enough that I didn't have any of those really breakthrough aha moments that I hear other people having. It's not like suddenly I could hear the birds sing. It was more like the smaller things. So I would hear people move a piece of paper, and the sound was just really harsh, and really almost, I guess, louder. Another thing is, so I wear behind the ear hearing aids. So they're kind of this kind of a headphone thing. And the microphone is on the top of it. So every time I brush my hair over my ear, that sound would pick up on the microphone. So it's, there was a lot of different sounds that maybe I hadn't been hearing before, was just noticing more. And a lot of it was just my brain readjusting to hearing differently.
I'm assuming the equipment you use today is not the same equipment you used as a teenager.
Right.
How has the equipment improved over that time?
Oh my gosh.
Assuming that it has.
Yeah, it's improved a lot. So um, actually, the hearing aids that I have now, my hearing loss is, I guess, bad enough that I do have to wear the behind the ear hearing aid. So, but even then, like they've gotten smaller, sleeker. When I wear my hair down, people can't see them at all. They kind of, match my hair color a little bit. One thing that was huge for me now that I wish I'd had back then is actually that hearing aids are much more waterproof. Not necessarily waterproof, but like sweat proof. So now when I go play tennis, I can wear my hearing aids and they don't die. When I started wearing hearing aids, I was playing field hockey and I would be, chasing the ball, and all of a sudden my hearing aids would cut out because of sweat and moisture and everything. And that was not ideal. So it's actually things like that. It's not even the technology of being able to hear better. It's being able to just function and not have the hearing aid just die on me all the time. And another great thing is the Bluetooth connectivity. So actually, when somebody calls me on my cell phone, the sound goes right to my hearing aids, so I can hear them right in my ears, which is great. It's also really fun because I can listen to anything on my cell phone through my hearing aids. And I think, especially for my dad, I think that's been huge because he cannot hear on a landline, but when people call him on his cell phone, it goes right to his hearing aids and he can actually have a conversation with them. So I think the technology has improved a lot, and I think it's going to continue to get better. I think there's still a lot of ways it can keep improving, but I think it definitely will keep getting better.
Is it getting less expensive at the same time?
So that is a question about unbundling. So at present, hearing aids have been so expensive because the cost of the hearing aid is bundled with the cost of the audiologist in most places. So when you buy a hearing aid, you're also buying the services of the audiologist, which is super important because that means you can go back in but so they can connect your hearing aids to your hearing test and make it so that you're actually hearing at the level that you should be hearing. So audiology services also include a lot of rehabilitation services and different support services that can be very helpful for people. So I think there has been a push going forward to unbundle the cost of hearing aids from the audiological services. And, I think that's great to some degree if you can get a cheaper hearing aid. But the con of that is that you're not necessarily having a professional set your hearing aid up and having someone you could go back to with issues with your hearing aid. So there are pros and cons, but yes, hearing aids are definitely not cheap, and that is an issue.
Yeah. How often do you have a test?
So not very often. That's my hearing also is pretty stable now. So I got my hearing tested a lot when I was younger, but that's because it was changing, like slightly, but it still was changing a bit. But now I'm sort of at a stage where it's been pretty constant or pretty much at the same level for the past several years. But generally what I try to do when I change schools or change locations, I try to set myself up with an audiologist wherever I am. So at least I have, here's my hearing test, from this place. I have it in that hospital system. If anything happens, I know who to go to. So.
On those rare occasions when you don't use hearing aids, is it a night and day difference for you?
Not really. I do get like things are a bit more muffled, but I can generally have a conversation maybe not a great conversation, but I can talk to people without it. And it's not like I take them out and I'm completely without sound. My hearing is enough that I can get most things. What I'm missing is sort of this mid-range, like consonants. So basically all of the speech frequencies. So really, it's for me, it's the conversations that become an issue.
Now you have your own website, and I want you to tell us first of all, how do you get to your website, and what do they find when they get there?
Yeah, so my website is www.jessicaswest.com. And basically it's a place where I've tried to distill my research career into something a little bit more accessible. I think I spend so much time reading journal articles. So, reading these, 10,000 word articles on that include a lot of scientific jargon and a lot of like statistical methods. And I would like to have a space where I can distill some of that into something that people can actually understand. So part of my website is just listing out my various publications with like a nice picture next to it. So to include like a little figure and some fun and less text. But I also have like links to different press releases that I've done and different ways that I've talked about my research outside of the sort of field of academia. And I also have a list of resources that I found helpful as someone with hearing loss. So I really like to read. Obviously, I do research, but I also like to read for fun. And I found that there's some really great authors out there who have written about hearing loss, both from like a personal perspective, but also meshing in different research experiences too. So I have a list of books that I found particularly helpful on my journey.
And a couple of those titles would be, there's David Lodge.
Yeah, so I really do like David Lodge's book, but
and I'm blanking on the title. Maybe you have it.
Death Sentence. Death Sentence.
DEAF, not death.
Yeah, DEAF. That's his play on words. And then T.C. Boyle wrote a book called Talk Talk, which is not necessarily about hearing loss, but the main character does have a hearing loss. And I found that, I thought it was really, I don't know, refreshing to have someone in the popular media be someone with a hearing loss and not be like a victim of their hearing loss, but actually just living. And then Catherine Bouton, Bouton, she wrote for the New York Times for a while. And then she has a hearing loss and she's written 2 books. One is Shouting Won't Help, and the other is Living Better with Hearing Loss. And both of those, they're a lot of research, a lot of putting it into context, or putting hearing loss into context, but in a way that is really accessible to the public. And what I really like is she brings in her personal experience with hearing loss too. So, you're not just reading something about, hearing loss from a third party perspective, you're hearing it from her perspective. And I think that was really, really helpful.
Might you want to write a book someday?
My mother keeps telling me to do that. We'll see. I do like the idea of writing a book. I think what I would really like to do is figure out a way to distill research, distill what I'm doing, what I'm reading, what I'm finding, and get it to people. I don't know if something, like Twitter, you have like whatever, 280 characters, like that's a much smaller, more digestible way of interacting in some cases. I don't know what's the best way to go about reaching people and sharing information. I mean, one of the reasons I did a master's in public health was to try to learn different strategies for taking research and making it accessible. And, you know, I'm not really at the stage where I can do some big like evaluation project or anything, but I do hope to be able to do something a little bit more helpful for the general public, because I don't know, these academic journals, they're great, but it really, this research needs to get to people who it'll benefit, not just other academics.
For what it's worth, I think your mother's right.
Well,
Usually is.
yeah, I know. I generally try to listen to her.
In the United States, is hearing loss on the increase?
So I think there's conflicting evidence there. There's definitely been some research that's saying no, it's not like necessarily rising. However, we do have an aging population, so we do have quite a lot of hearing loss. Hearing loss is very common in infants. There are a lot of infants that are born with hearing loss, but in terms of it's much more skewed towards older ages. So, like, you know, if you look at the population under the age of 45, it's probably about 6%. If you look at like 45 to 65, it jumps up to about 17%. Then you look at 65 to 75, you're closer to like 27, 28%. Then 75 and older, 45%. So you start to get a much, you know, it's very much an age-related health issue.
Before we wrap up, I have to ask you, why are you on Nantucket?
Well, so my parents live here. They've been living here year-round since 2004. So when I went off to boarding school, they moved here. We'd been coming here, you know, both sides of my family for generations. And I'm the youngest. So when I was out of the house, my parents were like, well, we want to move to Nantucket. So I've been here since March 2020. The longest I've had the pleasure of living here. And it was really due to the pandemic. So I spent my 5th and 6th year of my dissertation just here on Nantucket, which was really lovely for, you know, being able to work from home in such a special place I'm very fortunate.
Well, I assume you got more work done more quickly being here rather than on campus at Duke. Is that right?
Well, it's Nantucket's distracting. There's so much. I love being able to go for walks outside, and that's something that, you know, being able to go into all of these open spaces and not necessarily run into anyone, especially, you know, during the pandemic when, you know, we're trying to be safe and, you know, keep my parents safe. So yeah, it's been really nice being able to take the dog for just a nice, long, relaxing walk. And obviously the summer is here. There's so many people, so it's a little overwhelming, but
More good than bad, though.
yeah,
I think we would agree.
yeah.
Dr. Jessica West, thank you very much for joining me. This has been fun and educational, and write that book.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
For Channel 18 and Nantucket Community Television, I'm Charlie Walters on Profiles. Thanks for tuning in, and please join me again.